Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning if you're in the other side of the world, and welcome to our latest community conversation. And today we've got some experts from our MEAL working group who are going to be talking through how to generate evidence for anticipatory action. And if you don't know what MEAL is, then it's monitoring, evaluation, accountability and learning. I knew I'd get it. So yeah, thanks very much for joining us. If you've got questions for the experts or for the working group members, please just pop them in the chat and we'll get to those during the call. Some people have given us questions beforehand, so we'll tackle those during the call. And yeah, feel free to sort of drop comments and share feedback and ideas as well in the chat as well. It's there for everyone. And so without further ado, I'll hand over to Clemens Gross from the Climate Centre and from WFP, who's going to start us off.
Thanks so much, Tim. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this community conversation. So today it's all about generating evidence for anticipatory action, your questions answered. And so what we will do is we have about 10 to 15 minutes to give you a glimpse of what's in a MEAL briefing note, which we as the Monitoring and Evaluation, Accountability and Learning Practitioners Group in Anticipatory Action wrote collaboratively last year. The link to that was in the announcement for today's call, but is also again shown at the end of the slide deck. And perhaps, Tim, you could pop it into the chat. So we will give you a 10-15 minute overview of what's in that briefing note in the guidelines. And then we will just really open it up and have a conversation to see what are your questions, what are your thoughts on evidence generation, on anticipatory action, and see if we together can answer that as MEAL practitioners, or just scratch our heads together with you to see how and where we can learn more. Okay, so first, in our little briefing, we had some thoughts about what's different about monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning for anticipatory action, and why think about that perhaps differently than just any MEAL for any kind of development or humanitarian program. So the question is it different than the normal, if you will? And the answer is not really, but AA interventions are sort of triggered and guided by forecasts, meaning they carry some uncertainty, and uncertainty is not faced by conventional programming, and that does have implications for evidence generation. So the first, obviously, is it is uncertain whether, when, and where the hazard will occur. That means, on the one hand, from a practitioner's perspective, we may act in vain if we're deploying assistance for an event, for example, for a cyclone that either does not make landfall in the end, or just that changes trajectory 12 hours out and doesn't hit where we expected it to hit. From a MEAL practitioner's perspective, that means if we wanted to collect, for example, baseline data to know what the situation was in the areas where we think something will happen and where we will intervene, that would there's a risk of that also happening in vain because we're collecting data in places that might in the end not be affected. That means if we wanted to cover all potential intervention areas, that might be a very expensive endeavor and may not be feasible at all. It also means that the severity of hazard conditions, of how hard people were hit by a flood or by a cyclone or by a drought, might actually be different from place to place, and hence the comparability of groups in our sample might also be different. Second difference, there is a specific and often short window of opportunity to act. From a practitioner's perspective, the obvious implication is that we may actually be late, and that might call into question the theory of change of how we thought our assistance would make a difference to people's experience, kind of preparedness and resilience going into or preparing for an extreme event if we're late. From a MEAL perspective, that also means maybe there actually isn't any time to collect data between when the trigger goes off and when we activate. So the data, whichever we try to collect, if we do manage it before the event, may not fully reflect sort of pre-event, pre-hazard conditions. And it, excuse me, and it, excuse me, and it also means that timing of data collection at any point is absolutely crucial, because whether or when we're intervening and how effective that might be and what are the results we can observe will depend on sort of when the hazard occurred, when in relation to that hazard we managed to assist people. Was that 3 days before a cyclone made landfall? Was that 1 week before a flood peak? And when are results expected to fully materialize? So if we go in 1 week after a peak flood and want to measure, for example, if our intervention was effective in preventing a cholera outbreak, does that make sense? Our numbers that we will collect will likely be low because cholera outbreaks, the incidence of cholera and the incubation period is 12 to 14 days. So we may have come too early. But also waiting 3 months may be too late to see any effects or for people to recall what occurred. And third and last difference is that we're acting before extremes. So something that isn't known in advance and that is different from what people usually experience. And what that means is no change in the outcomes, in the indicators we're interested in, could actually be a desirable result, because we want to prevent people from dropping off a cliff of, say, food security, of vulnerability. So this is very different from your conventional kind of, you want to see numbers move up and to the right in terms of a positive trajectory. It also means that traditional before and after comparisons of only looking at program participants or beneficiaries of anticipatory action might not be the best way to go about it. Okay, second area where in this briefing you find some kind of thoughts and pointers about is now cognizant of what's different between AA and other kind of programming approaches. What are the types of results that we actually want to now measure, that we want to monitor and evaluate, wanting to know if we're making a difference? We think they fall in three broad domains of change. The first and often most important one is the individual or the household level. So are we managing to protect lives and livelihoods, people's physical and psychological well-being, nutrition and food security, but also their assets, meaning their possessions, either we often call them productive assets, so their farming equipment, their fishing equipment, their livestock, but also their personal belongings, their housing structures, their their beds and tables, etc. Are we enabling people to recover faster and strengthen their resilience? That is sort of one big outcome area that we frequently see researched in this area. Second is humanitarian sort of systems or institutions. So oftentimes AA interventions don't happen in a vacuum, but we invest in coordination with partners, in kind of institutionalizing anticipatory mechanisms, and all these things that they aren't kind of the main focus of this briefing note, but just to say there is some guidance on how we think about assessing whether we're strengthening capacities and institutions in this regard. But it's not the main focus of either the briefing or today's meeting. And lastly, also one sort of important type of change or result is obviously forecasting. So the capacity to forecast certain events, the model skill and accuracy, communication of those forecasts to those where it matters, meaning communities, households, but also humanitarians and implementers wanting to implement anticipatory action. And sorry, there isn't actually a session on trigger reviews this afternoon, but one does that with trigger reviews, and sort of that is where that falls. Okay, and now the main course, if you will, although we only touch on it briefly here, is we look at the methods with which we assess results. Joyce.
Thanks, Clemens. So maybe just building on what Clemens was saying about some of the key questions that we ask. So if we go to the next slide, similar to kind of evaluations and research for other sectors, there's kind of two main buckets, so similar to for anticipatory action as well. So the first one is around outcomes and impact, so things around what difference did anticipatory action make compared to those that may have received more traditional humanitarian response, so things that maybe happen after the crisis has already happened. Thinking about intended impacts, whether it has achieved it or why it has failed to achieve it, for whom the anticipatory action did work for. So thinking about kind of diversity, inclusion, and equity in terms of how anticipatory action was delivered and designed. Similarly, reach and benefit to marginalized groups, experiences and perspectives of different people that maybe experienced the crisis, but also received the anticipatory actions. And then finally, under also the outcomes and impacts, thinking about the cost effectiveness, cost efficiency, and cost benefit and value for money aspect of the anticipatory action. Probably just to say here, what's very important is around thinking about the counterfactual to anticipatory action. So a lot of the times we're thinking about what is the value of acting earlier compared to traditional response. And so when we look at outcomes and impacts, when we talk about the methodologies coming up, really important is to think about, what is the counterfactual scenario we're comparing this to in order to say that the changes or the benefits are attributable to earlier action through anticipatory action compared to maybe potentially later response. The second part is around the process. So what's worked well, less well, what could be improved. Clemens has mentioned the trigger review as being a very key component of anticipatory action process reviews specifically. And then finally, we've put in under there as well the accountability aspect. So in terms of the project design and implementation, how accountable are we to the affected population in our anticipatory action activities? So going into the actual methods, which is in the next slide. So just to caveat that this isn't an exhaustive kind of list of methodologies that are available and used to assess anticipatory action. We're just kind of presenting some of the things that are currently used in the sector, as well as things that we're looking forward to or looking to explore in the sector. So on the left, you see there's quantitative, so this includes randomized control trials, quasi-experimental design. So these are things around designing comparison groups. And as mentioned earlier, what's quite important with anticipatory action is to think about the counterfactual. So in a lot of scenarios for RCTs and quasi-experimental design, the comparison group would be a group that might have received no intervention at all, but ideally a group that has received an intervention, but maybe later than anticipatory action, so later in the crisis timeline. There's also things around pre-post program participants. So this is thinking about, baselining and kind of end-line assessments, and then economic evaluation, things around return on investment, cost efficiency, value for money analysis. In the actual brief, there is more detail around example kind of evaluations that have deployed these techniques or methodologies. So highly recommend you look at the brief itself for more examples. There's also a few resources out there. I think, for example, the International Refugee Rescue Committee has something around cost analysis guidance. So you can look at that for the economic evaluation side of things. And then on the accountability side of things, for example, the Center for Disaster Protection also has something around thinking about accountability for affected populations in disaster risk financing. In terms of qual methods, there's quite a few here. So then there's missing voices, user experience. This is more about looking at or like systematically thinking about which identity groups, what intersectional identities might be more vulnerable in certain contexts, and thinking about how to explore and see kind of their differential exposure to risk, but also how they experience anticipatory action and whether it has benefited or kind of failed to meet certain needs or accessibility considerations. Theory-based impact assessment is also based on a very robust theory of change, and as Clement said, it's very much about thinking about the timing and breaking down the different assumptions behind causal links. Outcome harvesting is also an approach around qualitative methods and is a similar kind of process of looking at a theory of change, but then thinking about or being a bit more open and exploratory around what types of outcomes beneficiaries have received, and from there kind of tracing back what are the factors that have led to this. And then finally, on the mixed methods, there's success case method, which is also based on the theory of change and describes first kind of the impact model, and then thinking about a survey to look at a small sample size and then identify what are the successful or less successful cases, and from there identifying what are the key factors that have made certain cases successful or less successful. And then Q methodology is kind of based on ranking different statements and thinking about or exploring different perspectives and experiences around and receiving anticipatory action. So this is really thinking about capturing the diverse range of experiences. So targeting different types of intersectional kind of identity groups and kind of taking a sample from there to do in-depth qualitative interviews to understand what kind of different perspectives or different experiences arises from these different personas. Again, just a quick note, in this slide, we don't really talk about the process level. Process level methodologies kind of uses quite known methodologies like after action reviews, trigger reviews, etc. So that's generally just thinking about what's worked well and less well throughout the program implementation. Perfect.
Thanks, Joyce.
Over.
So now, lastly, for just 3 more minutes, in this meal briefing note, we also put together sort of our collective experience about what we saw, what typically goes wrong or can go wrong in evidence generation for anticipatory action, and sort of hence sort of easy or obvious remedies to fix what can go wrong. So the first one is unclear theories of change or theories of change that don't apply anymore. For example, because our assistance came much later than we had planned, and therefore our distribution of, say, evacuation equipments or what have you may not actually have been useful anymore to people at the time when they received the assistance. So therefore, although this should be obvious and standard, we think it's important to always outline how actions are expected to translate into measurable results, and to be transparent in our research and in our actions about whether there were changes in, for example, context and assumptions, but also the limitations of our theories of change. Second, often we see missing information about the timeline and basic facts of both the activation and the research about it. So when did the activation take place in relation to the hazard conditions, in relation to peak hazard conditions, and then when did research take place in relation to these things and to implementation? Were we, did we come in 6 months after the fact, so people will have likely forgotten, or were we too soon, too late? So all of that is really simply about including a timeline of events, what happened, when and where, also in our research, and to include essential facts about all of these components, both the hazard conditions, the AA implementation, and then our research activities. Third, being transparent about study design and methodology. So it's really crucial for the reader to preserve the credibility of the evidence we're generating about anticipatory action, to have clarity on what was the study design, what was our methodology, what was our sample size, for example, where did we collect the information, how representative is that of either all the flood affected people or the people we meant to serve. Fourth, often baseline data is incomplete or missing, which is absolutely understandable given the constraints that we started with about kind of narrow windows of opportunity and the uncertainty what happens when and where. But so we have to be transparent about whether or not we have baseline information and what that baseline information, if we have it, is representative of. Does it really capture kind of pre-hazard, pre-assistance conditions or not? And might there be other sources of information to make up for missing baseline data, like secondary data sources or types of indicators that don't change very much over time, like demographics and socioeconomic background characteristics, which we might be able to collect at a later point in time. Now, second to last, result indicators aren't always clearly defined or not standardized. So when we measure, for example, food security or the incidence of morbidity, so disease or mortality, it helps to rely on standardized indicators that others have already tried and tested as much as possible. It helps us to have confidence in the validity of that measure, measuring what we're actually interested in, and it helps to compare results across contexts also. So it's a good idea to always look around and see what have others already done in this area that I'm interested in, and can I perhaps build on what they're doing? Can I replicate what they're doing? And definitely always define what is that concept that you're measuring? How are you defining food insecurity if you're not using a standardized indicator? How are you measuring, let's say, psychosocial distress if you're not using one of the standardized metrics? And finally, an area of huge interest is return on investment or cost benefit analyses, which often, though, are accompanied by either unclear or overly optimistic assumptions. And so here, transparency is again already goes 90% of the way to let everyone know, are you assuming that having, I don't know, saved somebody's goat will provide them with benefits 20 years into the future, and every year you're counting that benefit with like $300 kind of thing? Or are you being more humble in your assumptions? And just to be transparent about what are the ingredients that go into that return on investment calculation, and how are you kind of calculating, how are you discounting, etc., the benefits that accrue to the household or to the individual. Fantastic. So if you want to know more, you can, on the left, read that briefing paper, which is on the Anticipation Hub, and it has all that Joyce and I just briefly talked about. If you want to learn more about our practitioners group, then you can also find more on the website and get in touch with Joyce and myself. We can put you on the mailing list. We have monthly calls every last Wednesday of the month, such as we have today, where we share what we're each working on, ask questions, kind of put our heads together to see how can we generate good evidence on anticipation. So this is just a super quick overview, and now we want to see, so do we already have questions from the floor, either on what you've just heard, or have you brought any questions with you that you just want to throw into the room? And we've also received some questions in advance, so let's see what we have. Okay, I see one question in the chat here about do we have any standard tools available? It would be great to see these tools, especially for assessing the domains of change. And can we share the slide deck? So we can definitely, I think, Tim, circulate the PDF of the slide deck afterwards. So the links are also included. So on tools, there's two things. So the group has started putting together a list of standardized indicators by domain of change, let's say. So to give you pointers as to, if I want to measure, for example, food security, these are the standardized indicators that organizations use. And you can then easily find, for example, food consumption scores. Okay, here's the website of FAO or WFP, where you find the tool, in terms of the questionnaire module, how that's administered, how it's calculated. The same for the other most popular result indicators, or let's say the most well-researched, and that's mostly food security and livelihoods. In other areas, unfortunately, not so much, and we're always looking for more suggestions in this. Finally, when you're asking about tools specifically, I understand that as primarily, in my mind, that means survey questionnaires, but please specify if that's not what you're after. So we have, as part of the guidance that's linked on our AA Meal Practitioner Group website, for example, there is the WFP. It has a WFP sticker on it, but it's very much sort of applicable across guidance on monitoring evaluation of anticipatory action interventions. That includes a, if you will, kitchen sink survey questionnaire with a ton of standardized modules in most of these areas of change that you can access, that you can download, and that you can sort of make your own. So another question, what about conducting post-distribution monitoring? What about it? Do you want to come off mute and elaborate on your question?
Can you hear me, please?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. So my question is, for instance, there is in the anticipatory action, we can conduct or we can provide cash distribution, multi-purpose cash maybe. So for that purpose, shall we conduct a post-distribution monitoring? Is it advisable concerning with the anticipatory action? Thank you.
Does someone else from the group want to tackle that first, maybe? I see Joyce and Claire, you're visible, or anyone else who is present from the group who wants to take that?
Maybe I can start and then I'll see if other people would like to add. I think the key thing for the PDM is looking at the timeliness of the interventions. As Clemens mentioned earlier, the key thing that we're assessing is really, how timely was the assistance? When did it arrive? When were people able to use the assistance, especially for fast onset hazards? Maybe the cash was received, but then they weren't able to use it beforehand. So I think those kind of things are really important because any impact will then depend on how efficiently or effectively we were able to implement those that we were expecting to implement and kind of help communities. I think that's the main one in terms of the difference between maybe like a normal PDM and something for anticipatory action. I think the timeliness aspect is definitely, something to look into for that. But not sure if anyone else wanted to come in.
Corbe, go.
Yeah, so maybe from the experience from WFP, our teams tend to go with what we're used to and what we're comfortable with, which tends to be generic PDMs that follow corporate procedures, right? So as we were just saying, it's not only the timing that may not be like WFP has this corporate rule that 10 days after a distribution, it's mandatory to start doing a PDM, right? Upon access and security issues. Now, 10 days after I have distributed AA, if it's for fast onset, maybe it's worth it. If it's for slow onset, it's nothing. It's wasted money, right? So sometimes we tend to go down the road of doing what we're used to because we think it's good in itself when it doesn't necessarily serve the purpose. And then also PDMs doesn't allow you to attribute anything to the cash transfer or the actual anticipatory assistance that you have provided. So PDM for what, depending on what you want to measure, right? Most of the times I say don't waste any money on a PDM 10 days after, because then might as well not do anything. So the PDM looks at processes and it looks maybe at some outcome level indicators, but again, you can't even say that what you've given in a context of a humanitarian turmoil, it's actually to being or to doing that assistance before. So for me, I'm a bit like against generic PDMs. And even if they are like AA filter or AA improved, because they don't take me anywhere that we don't know. Of course, people are going to be happy that they received something, right? Some might have received it before, some might have done it after. We know that. We don't need to do a PDM for that. So if we're talking about real evidence and real interest in understanding the impact on people, for me, a PDM is not enough, no matter how good it is done in terms of questionnaire and timing. That's a very personal take, but so we have a lot of these coming and getting done. So PDM, it's the bare minimum, doesn't take as much, doesn't give as much information, and then I would push for a minimal counterfactual. But it's hard. It's hard to work in the field with that over.
So as everyone who isn't part of the group sees, so this is a wonderful like jamboree of the group just chiming in on, this is thinking out loud, right? Collective responding to questions. So please feel free also as others are talking to come with your own perspective or share more questions. Claire.
Thanks, comments. And it's a great question. I think I agree with Urbe and Joyce's points about this. PDMs help us get more at process. And even when we have collected some food security indicators in a PDM, we're often doing these just with a smaller percentage of all of the people who have received the assistance. So it only provides just minimal insight. If we're doing an impact evaluation of sorts, we do have a larger survey planned. And so it's the things that we get more value out of that are just understanding what might have happened, how people might have been using the cash, other challenges that could explain what we see for the outcomes. It's been less helpful for some of those impact indicators if we've already made that investment, but it's a good quality and process check if we are investing heavily in research to at least make sure things we've documented process quite well. Over.
Ariel.
Yeah, and I will just build exactly on what Claire was going to say, is that maybe not so much for impact evaluation, but certainly it can give you some valuable information. And then also building on what Urbe said, a generic PDM is not necessarily going to get you the precise kinds of information that you're going to need to just make improvements in your program. And so some of the things that, like within the Red Cross, we've suggested adding to the PDM templates is asking whether or not that, like when the aid was used, whether or not could it be used as intended before the hazard peaked. If cash is included, what they used it on in anticipatory, and if it was an anticipatory faction, whether or not the timing kind of in that anticipatory space was optimal or could still be adjusted. And then because early warning is often a piece of these activations, really understanding when people first received the early warning, from whom, via what channels, and how they would have preferred to receive that, since it's a good opportunity to kind of improve the overall early warning as well. And again, that won't get you at impact, but it will still get you some interesting programmatic information. Over.
Great. Okay, comprehensive answers on post-distribution monitoring. Other questions? And hello to everyone who's saying hello in the chat. Lovely to have all of you from all over the world. While you're thinking about more questions potentially, we received a few additional ones beforehand that perhaps I'll share one of them, which is, so what's the relationship between evaluation, accountability, and learning, and how do they reinforce each other in anticipatory action projects? Sounds a bit like a test question. Does anyone want to have a stab at this relationship between the E and the A and the L? And we're so comfortable with uncomfortable silence. Good bet.
I like silence, but I'm gonna give it a go. I think at the beginning of AA, evidence was a must-have because we needed to prove, to show, or to even discover ourselves if all of that effort was worth it, in terms of like, we were big believers that, common sense tells you that if you provide people with the means to protect themselves before, it should be better than just waiting for the impact to happen, right? But we didn't have the evidence to back that up at all. And we're just now starting to get it, right? So I think it was accountability to the donors that believed in this at the very beginning. It was learning for ourselves to see where we had to change or adjust our programs. And it was to evaluate them as they were being implemented, which these also evolves. It's a very evolving arena, I think, anticipatory action, right? Whereas now I feel it's more like if you want to take this to the scale that it should go because of how many hazards are going to keep impacting the most vulnerable, then you are just as accountable and you just have to make just as an effort on evaluating to understand how many of the resources should we put before and after, because these should not be looked in isolation from regular traditional response, resilience programs, climate adaptation programs, whatever other operations we might be leading. So you're accountable to the people because we assume that we do better just by giving something before. But we're seeing, for example, in drought, that if you provide an anticipatory transfer assistance for the projected failed season, it is happening at the same time as the past failed season lean support, right? So you can create a lot of confusion, you can create a lot of mismatch between the communities. So I think it's accountability to everyone, ourselves, the people, the donors, and also the learning and the evaluation side to understand how many and who should we prioritize for the before, because we won't be able to cover them all, and how and who should we leave for the after. And those for me are the key questions moving forward. Otherwise, we will never reach scale and we risk of just remaining like tiny humanitarian, small scale, not pilots, because they're already, I think, quite established programs, but like, you know, to a certain level. So I think that would be my sort of thinking. Over.
Anyone else wants to chime in on that?
I guess maybe just to add on Hervé's point, when I think about anticipatory action, I think there's the anticipatory action aspect of implementing it, but then there's also kind of that contingency planning process, the anticipatory action protocol development process. And so at Start Network, at least when we think about kind of meal and how evaluation, accountability, and learning link together, we kind of think of it as not just about the implementation of the anticipatory action, but then also how do we involve communities in building the anticipatory action protocols or like the contingency plans? How much ownership do they have, and what kind of community consultations happened? What whose voices are heard in those kind of spaces? But then also the second aspect is like the forecasting element as well. I think a lot of the times there's a bit of a balancing act between, you know, the risk information and the forecasting that might sit or is less accessible to communities, and then maybe on the ground as well, they may be already experiencing, you know, the flood or heat waves, but then, you know, the anticipatory action isn't activating. So it's like there's also a bit of bridging that gap between what people experience versus in terms of the scientific modeling and like the activation of fund or like the release of funds like that, there's a bit of mismatch there as well. So then there's a bit of like bridging that gap and kind of communicating the transparency and managing expectations around how anticipatory action actually happens, and, community experiences within that. But yeah, over.
What about?
Yeah, I think when Joyce was speaking, this thing came up to me. We're seeing more and more that we as anticipatory action community, whether it's government implementing, an agency implementing, we're keeping the forecasting, the forecasters or the national Met agencies more accountable to their job. Like you can't mess up, whether it's on the model, whether it's on the timing, whether it's on the quality, on the whatever, because we are providing or not providing assistance based on what they say, right? Whereas I think before it was like, oh, you know, they said it was going to flood and it didn't, and so nothing would happen until it actually impacted. So we weren't pushing the early warning system to be so sharp and improve, right? Whereas I think through AA, that is sort of the base, like the base of it all. So we're coming back to the meteorologists and the hydrologists saying, you guys gotta improve this. You have a full year for next season. We can't mess up like this. Right. So I think that's a cool aspect as well, the side effects of doing that. And then when we engage with social protection systems, then it's them getting the national med agency accountable too. So it's not even a humanitarian playground. It's more of a political and like governmental and real change happening there. Because obviously the forecast, if they get improved, they don't get just improved for AA, they get improved for a bunch of other things. So I think that's an interesting element of accountability as well. Over.
And I'll put in one more on the learning side of things before we move on to the next question, which is, I think one nice thing to see is that many organizations, I think in anticipatory action, have instituted after action reviews as a key learning mechanism, that where they bring together the evidence from, say, evaluations, ideally from accountability mechanisms where they've engaged with communities, and then have these meetings that are sometimes an afternoon, sometimes 3 days, where everyone who was involved in an activation or implementation comes together and see what have we learned about, you know, did this work, where did we fall short, etc., to do better next time. That said, I've read some very good after action review reports. So I have observed these lessons. Whether these observed lessons have been learned the next time around when the next activation happens in the same place 2 years ago is another question. I think that there's still, but so that is to say, it's this learning of what we can do better and implementing it the next time around. It's a challenge that's not unique to anticipation, which is sort of what all practitioners struggle with. So we've had a great sort of, let's say, confirmation of, or a point on the role of PDMs as sort of rapid real-time course correction tools from Yozan in the chat, which is a great observation. And then Tim, you're raising a wonderful, wonderful devil's advocate question in the chat, which is, if organizations are mostly monitoring their own interventions, how robust are the results? So is there a risk of inherent bias to show the intervention worked and that AA as an approach does what we all wanted to do? So are we just giving ourselves the best marks? What's happening? Any thoughts? Just to say, okay, I'll start. Often, I think all organizations would ideally want to see the highest, most robust levels of evidence, which would ideally be generated independently. But independent evaluation or evidence generation tends also to be the most expensive one, right? Having like contracting either the local research partner or an international local consortium of some sort to evaluate your intervention, etc., and it becomes quite pricey. So while I think everyone wants that and everyone appreciates it, that has happened at the most robust level. The randomized controlled trials we've seen on anticipatory action, that many of them, or sort of the ones that are there, are either sort of WFP or /OCHA IRC kind of products, have been done at the highest level of rigor and independence, I would say. But that doesn't mean that we all are cognizant, I think, of the limitations of the in-house, smaller, more nimble products that still try to learn something useful. So I think it's a sign or symptom of humanitarians trying to bridge that gap between academic analytical rigor and practical financial feasibility. So when we see the Red Cross kind of go out and do their smaller sample quasi-experimental study that still involves beneficiaries and a control group, but using its own volunteers as enumerators, etc., that has huge kind of bias alarm bells going off, but at the same time, they're trying to learn something useful. So I wouldn't say it's the dominant approach that people are self-evaluating and just confirming it is, but it is something that is happening out of good intentions, I think, with caveats in terms of validity and generalizability of results. So I think as we're moving forward, and hopefully there will be sort of people can tap into other pockets of money for research funding for AA. We will see better research as the randomized control trials that are already there. I'm sure others have something to contribute there as well. Good,
So from WFP side, the Office of Evaluation is actually hosted in WFP, but it's independent of programs, right? So in that sense, the two RCTs that we did, or any that they do, it's independent of the ones that implemented it, although it's part of the big house of WFP, right? So those are quite independent, and we worked very closely with them. Also because when you let independent monitoring people run these things, they may not understand the nature and the design of the program, and so they try to measure for things that may not be able to find, right? So I think it's a joint work to balance each other off as well about what you can expect from an independent evaluation. I agree with Clemens on it doesn't necessarily mean independent is good in itself because of how much money. I may not want to throw $500,000 for an RCT somewhere when that could cover me for 2 other activations somewhere. So I think we have to be a bit cautious on assuming independence is good in itself. Although it is. And then what we're now trying to do is there's this MOU between OCHA and this Office of Evaluation hosted in WFP to assess through RCTs the interagency frameworks. So they are going to have to look at the timing of assistance, but not just WFP as with the 2 ones that we've done, but of the framework itself and the agencies that implement it, and then the impact of different packages of assistance combined, right? So I think that's an attempt, as Tim, you were saying, to try and push for more independent and collective evidence. But then at the same time, most of the time so far, what I've seen is if we get bad results, it's because it was a shitty implementation, not necessarily because AA in itself doesn't work, right? And I think that's something we also need to be very cautious about. It was for whatever reason, the operations were not running as smoothly and timely as they should have, and therefore what you're going to collect and the results you're going to get are not so maybe positive, right? So that's another angle as well to keep in mind. Over.
Hannah.
Me? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Just wanted to add on to what Obe was saying. From OCHA's side, we are increasingly being asked to show more rigorous independence evidence, but at the same time, they're costly and time-consuming and resource-intensive to produce, right? So what we are trying to do is to collaborate on joint evaluations that allow us to pool our resources, pool our data capacities, technical capacities to do something rigorous where we work together. And the MOU that Obe mentioned is part of that process. And in Chad, right now, we are trying to work with WFP and FAO to do a joint impact evaluation. That way, instead of doing independent PDMs and sort of evaluating our own interventions, why don't we look at the interventions jointly? And that involves a lot of planning to make it work. We need to look at how joint AA interventions are. Are we targeting the same households? And how do you share data to make sure that we have the same household list when you go out and implement? So there's a lot of nuance to it. And that's why we want to plan ahead a bit. And instead of looking at individual activations or AA implementations, let's look at what are the priority contexts and questions around AA that we should focus collectively for the next 2 years? And how can we plan a bit ahead of that? How can we start that engagement in country right now so that when there's an activation in the next season, we are ready to go with data collection and we already have the design in place? So it's still work in progress and baby steps. But I think that even now has generated a lot of learning on how can we ensure program quality so that we are measuring the impact of a well-implemented program. And Ube has a valid point. If you don't find impact, it could be due to a lot of reasons, including the quality of the program. That's also why we are looking at, for impact evaluations and rigorous evaluations, we're looking at contexts where it has already activated once and they have sort of figured out the kinks in implementation. And we have better confidence that when it activates, things run relatively smoothly. So our advice so far to country offices has been that if you're doing AA for the first time, let's start with something light, like a post-distribution monitoring that can help us understand the timing and sort of the quality and some of the beneficiary perceptions, and we can plan for something more rigorous in the next iteration. So that's how we have been thinking through the program quality issues as well.
Thanks, Hannah. Claire.
Yeah, this is another great question. And I think it's a tough one because there will always be bias, like even when we've contracted independent enumerators, or even if we contract a data firm that's sort of entirely separate to IRC. Sometimes with the enumerators we contract, there's sort of, someone manages them at IRC. The people that we interview still know, oh, I was a part of an IRC program or a WFP program or whoever's program. And that's why this research has been built around that. Like there's always going to be some sort of response bias. There are things at a survey level we can do to sort of understand where that, like how that response might be more positive, more negative, or what have you, that are lower cost to sort of feed into a survey, but that's always going to be there. I think even when we are moving to those more external evaluations, and it is a real challenge. But I think this is also where separating out some of the more monitoring and the impact data collections and the process data collections can be super helpful just to understand and sort of have that clearer expectations over what each round of data collection or type of data collection is doing. But of course, all of these steps comes with more costs, more time considerations. But I guess to play devil's advocate to the devil's advocate is the bias will always be there, even as we're trying to externalize evaluations. Over.
Kamran.
Thank you, Clemens. Exactly. At FAO, we also have, I think, this independent reviewer. It's hard to get an independent reviewer, and in a lot of organizations like WFP, FAO, we also have an independent evaluation within FAO, which is the Office of Evaluation, which is not external, but its motive is to evaluate unbiased evaluation without being affected by giving full marks to your own team, etc. It's not the idea. But then we also have this distinction between a country office and HQ, where country office does the implementation part. They have the resources, they implement it, while HQ helps them evaluate or evaluates on their behalf. And this evaluation can only be evaluation of whether we are doing the right things. How things happen in the field, whether things are being done right, is something which field does, whether they delivered the money correctly on time to the right people, etc. This is the process which has to be monitored by the team itself in the field who implement it, where HQ does whether we did the right thing, whether this policy was good enough, which is our part. If the results are not good, we still publish it because we still did the work, we did the evaluation, we were paid to do this evaluation. So in theory, we are somewhat independent in that sense. And then this independency or this the advocate of this publication or this research could be an external evaluator. That is where peer review comes in, right? So if you did a good job and peer review thinks that you did a good job, then it can become a common knowledge which everyone can use, and thus does not need to have all researches does not have to be independent or external. This system where we can have independent reviewer can kind of let us be without that. Let us live in the world where we can do evaluations ourselves and let someone else review it just to give that credentials or that credibility. Over. Thanks.
Yeah, what about?
Sorry, no, I didn't want to say anything. Somehow I raised my hand, sorry.
So we have 4 more minutes here until the top of the hour. We could go a bit over if there's like overwhelming audience demand. I just want to encourage everyone again who is in the room, please feel free to either type your question in the chat or just raise your hand also, and Tim can give you the right so you can unmute yourself and just ask a question. If you're feeling still trigger shy, I have one more from that was submitted before, which is, are some methods more appropriate for anticipatory action than others? I guess research methods for anticipatory action. Any thoughts here? Yeah, what about?
I mean, I'm not an M&E person, right? I come from the program background, so I can't really speak about methodology, accuracy, and quality. But again, I think it depends on what are you trying to look for. So again, if you're trying to measure impact at household level and you aim for a PDM, well, it's just not connected, right? So because of where we stand in terms of anticipatory action, I think we still need a bunch of RCTs, at least on drought and packages of assistance and a few questions, as Hannah was saying, on collective AA that need to be answered at the highest level of robustness that we can. Whereas for others, I think counterfactuals are still relevant for country, even country policy. Like if we really want to change things at the government level, we're going to have to measure why is this better to do and to what extent is it better to do it before than after. So again, I would still push for higher robustness of methodologies rather than process-based ones. I think the qualitative element as a deeper dive of quantitative data is quite crucial to not miss out on the stories and the things that really can adjust the programs. But again, it's not like there's like a one perfect method. I don't think I'm coming again from the program side for AA. It's just what you're aiming for. And most of the times we want people to attribute outcomes through PDM. And I'm like, no, you can't. It's just like, so I think it's about the expectation as well with each methodology that we apply over.
Anyone else? Any other audience questions?
I do have one that has come up. I thought I'd unmute myself this time rather than let you read out my question. And it's something that, some people aren't that familiar with the actual practicalities, perhaps, of doing monitoring and evaluation. And I wondered if there's any kind of tips from the group about how to handle the process sensitively. We've talked about, how quickly after a distribution of cash, for example, you need to do the follow-up. But depending on the impact of the hazard or how severe it was, people might still not be in the kind of, may not be best positioned to be answering questions and doing kind of surveys and stuff. So I wondered if there's any kind of practical sort of tips around sensitivity or how to engage with communities or other people who you need to get results from, so that you're not doing it in a kind of intrusive way at a time that could be very, very, I mean, I'm lucky I've never been through a natural hazard, but it could be a very difficult time for people, I'm guessing. So what are some of the ways to sort of work around that and make sure that you're not imposing on people when they're having pretty bad time?
Marion. Nope, that was an accidental hand. Anyone wants to take this first stab at this, which is a great question, Tim. Thank you. Okay, folks have to jump off to other calls, which is fine. Thanks for joining us up to this point. We'll also wrap it up soon. So I think what we often say is that like implementation first, and obviously people sort of safety and dignity first. So research is, we never want to get in the way of either implementation. Like I first, don't go out yet, don't distribute that stuff. Let me first ask you a question. So that should never be the case. And also, I think so depending on what we want to measure, I think the recall period of that indicator in question is a good sort of guiding star. For example, some of the food security indicators have a recall period of either 1 week. So in the last week, tell me about what you ate, for example, or the last 30 days. So one could often say, come in, as soon as it is sort of safe for the community and yourself to go in. So you don't want to interview people while they're still sitting on the roofs of their houses. And B, when it makes sense, like thematically from what the indicator is measuring. So if you're measuring something that covers the last week, you want to make sure that week is meaningful from a programmatic perspective. Like, for example, if you distributed cash 2 days ago and you ask that question about the last week, it doesn't make sense, right? Because now you're mixing periods of with and without assistance, etc. And so for that, just to make another plug to the resources that are already there, in that WFP M&E guide, there is a sort of a decision matrix that helps you decide when to collect data. So all assuming we're only going in once people are fine, basically, when you and yourself are safe, etc. How to time data collection in relation to activation, hazard conditions, and outcomes you want to measure to help you decide, okay, when do I go in? So it's a really super relevant question, and we've also thought about it, and we have a bit of a tool for it. Not that solves everything. So nothing replaces hard thinking, I guess. Anyone else?
I guess maybe just to add, I think probably the basic principles of like do no harm, and making sure that in terms of enumerators, making sure that they're trained to kind of identify stress signals and just being aware of the participants' well-being while participating in the interview. I think that's super important, and just making sure that there's people are equipped with referral pathways or just like further information, those kind of things. So I guess just like those meal data collection principles that are relevant for any humanitarian context would be important here as well.
I have a final question. What was that? The come on you Reds behind Claire. What is on the banner? Is this Liverpool? Aha. Okay, there you go. Football reference. Okay.
I think Marion said she might have a question as well, just before we wrap up. If Marion is still with us.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you so much, Tim, for remembering. Thank you for these sessions, everyone. I had flicked through the mail guidance, but I still have one question because I haven't seen through the headlines, the headings. What about still doing impact evaluation of AA when the disaster did not happen as it was forecasted? I just would like to hear at Oxfam. We are also in our mail guide, we're also thinking about that, and coming up with a justification about why impact evaluation still needs to happen, because we're still building resilience, because the assumption is that we're still building resilience of communities that are receiving AA no matter if the cyclone did not happen as the same intensity or the route changes. And so I wanted to hear the experience of others in this group facing this sort of situation, and how much you're also considering about even putting resources into impact evaluation in those scenarios. Thank you.
Super interesting. Anyone has a thought on that?
That's a super interesting question. And I don't think I can answer to like because I guess as you've mentioned, there could be the risk didn't materialize or it didn't happen at the same intensity or different trajectory, etc. Just speaking from Start Network's experience, I think, so we have, I guess from our perspective, it's more like the basis risk. So if it doesn't happen, what we don't put so much resources in a huge impact evaluation, but I think what was really important in looking at if an event doesn't happen, like what is the communication like with the communities, because they might still experience that secondary impact, or so I think from that aspect it is extremely important to do some sort of community kind of review, or going back, maybe not like a full impact evaluation in a very kind of robust sense, but then I think some sort of consultation review is still necessary, and like thinking about how do we translate that forecasting, or like just like the complexities of how, let's say, like the cyclone trajectory changes, and what does that mean for actually doing anticipatory action practically, etc. So that's kind of the main thing that comes to mind from me, but I don't think that covers everything that you were asking for.
No, that's fine. I'm really consulting you broadly because we are developing a MIL guide that also makes sense to our disaster risk reduction work within Oxfam. And so we have put it on pause to really resume on developing this MIL guide. And so maybe this is a question that we can raise in future sessions that we have within the practitioners group, because that would be interesting.
I think, yeah, on the latter point, I think it would be fascinating to have a separate conversation about it. And so assuming, I would say most organizations approach AA not as a resilience building intervention, but sort of as a short-term measure to cover residual risk that's not addressed by other programmatic approaches, be it like resilience build, longer-term resilience building development kind of programs. Therefore, when you act in vain, so the alarm goes off, the event doesn't happen, but you've activated, it's beyond the theory of change, or maybe we've built it in some. So I'd be super curious how different organizations address that thing, which is should we evaluate a thing for which the intervention was never designed for? And I think one fascinating research topic about AA would be sort of the long-term effects of AA, whether the event happened or not. In both instances, I think both trajectories would be fascinating to see. Did this short-term measure, after all, your cash transfer is not something that covers 6 months of expenditure, but typically like 1 month or so. Like it's a tiny injection. So what longer term effects in terms of resilience or whatever could we expect? So I'd be maybe Marion, you could even like lead that or like give an impulse for that conversation, and then we have a group discussion about that after the summer.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Great. Looking at the time, Tim, what do you think? Like, unless there are burning questions in the audience, which I don't see people scrambling to the microphone, we may call it a day, don't we?
Yeah, I think so. So, yeah, thank you very, very much to everyone from the MIL working group. And I guess if people have got more questions or want to pick up another time, then feel free to reach out to the working group. I'll put the contact page at the top of the chat, but you can find it on the Hub website as well. And for those who are still with us, the next community conversation will be in July, I think the 22nd, and we're going to be looking at displacement. So the next working group in line is the displacement working group. So we'll be announcing that on the website. I haven't got around to it yet, but I will do it today or tomorrow. But yeah, thanks very much. It was a really interesting discussion, and it's a subject that I'm not very familiar with. So on a personal level, it was very interesting to find out more and find out what the working group is up to and sort of how we actually tackle some of these things. Because I think for everyone, evidence is the big thing that a lot of people are asking us about. Where's the evidence for anticipatory action? So yeah, it's been great to see the working group produce the guidelines last year and hold this call. And yeah, we look forward to hearing more. So yeah, thank you to Clemens and to Joyce and to everyone from the group, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.